So today's psalm begins, "If the Lord had not been on our side." Let Israel now say, "If it had not been the Lord who was on our side." And I don't know about you, but we're only at verse 1 and I've already got some questions. God on our side, isn't that a little bit problematic? Can God be on a side? Now, of course, like every competitive kid, I prayed my fair share of "God help my team win" prayers. And I didn't usually stop to consider that, of course, people on the other side were praying the very same prayer. And grown-ups do it too. We all know those people. In fact, maybe some of us are those people who have the whole routine for watching their favorite team on TV. It's like, if you pray while you're standing on your right foot and holding the remote in your left hand and wearing your jersey inside out, then your team will win. There's this whole charade, and sometimes we like to think that's how we get God or fate on our side, or maybe it's just how we feel some sense of control. On a more serious note, claiming God on our side has resulted in horrible acts of violence perpetrated by nations, groups of people, including our own nation, claiming God's direction as justification. So right off the bat, I'm a little skeptical of praying a psalm that starts out saying God was on our side. But fortunately, I don't think this is a psalm about either superstition or nationalizing power and trying to control God. I think if we read on, it's a psalm about vulnerability and trust. So let's start again, and this time we'll use the Message paraphrase, which tries to capture the idioms of the Bible. And it translates the first line a little differently. If God hadn't been for us, whenever everyone went against us, we would have been swallowed alive. Can you feel that? If God hadn't been for us when everyone went against us. That's what I call vulnerability. And vulnerability was well known to the people of Israel. This psalm, Psalm 124, is one of 15 psalms that are called the Songs of Ascents. They were likely written in the time after the Hebrew people had returned from captivity in Babylon and rebuilt their temple in Jerusalem. And these 15 psalms look back on the time of exile. They may have been sung as songs of pilgrimage, as thanksgiving and remembrance as the people ascended or went up to the temple for worship. I reference the Babylonian exile of the Hebrew people frequently in my sermons, and that's because I think there's really no way to overemphasize what a defining moment this was. I'd argue it's the defining historical event of the Old Testament, though there are other important ones as well. But so much lamentation and doubt was voiced in the Bible around the abandonment that the Hebrew people felt due to their destruction and being carried off into exile. And so much hope-filled prophecy and joyous praise was written around their return 70 years later to Jerusalem. And remarkably, their faith seems to have grown stronger from the experience. They began to see themselves, as the psalm shows, as a people God had delivered from the unlikeliest of circumstances. The Hebrew people could have been destroyed, but they were not. They could have been swallowed alive, but they were not. They could have been drowned in the raging waters of conquest, waters that came up to their neck, but they were not. They could have been trapped forever by hunters who ensnared them, but they were not. They were given the grace to fly free. These three analogies are what the psalm uses to describe layer by intensifying layer of how close the people felt to extinction. They were like prey, nearly swallowed alive by their predators. That in itself is scary. But then, what's more, They were like people in a great flood, nearly overcome by raging waters. This image is especially poignant if we consider the echoes in another psalm, Psalm 69, which begins, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck." That's how close a call it felt. Water up to their necks. And then again, a third analogy, they were like birds being hunted. And not only hunted, actually caught for a time. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the Fowlers, the psalmist writes. Fowlers in the time probably set grain on the ground to attract birds to a particular area and then dropped a net or cage once they had come to that area. To escape that trap once ensnared is extremely unlikely, probably requiring an error by the fowler. And so it felt the rebuilding of their nation, the return from exile, extremely unlikely. These images all capture the feeling of narrow escape and of vulnerability. Without divine intervention, it seemed, without the Lord who was for us when everyone else went against us, how could we have made it out alive? Vulnerability is a human experience. So many of us sitting here this morning could recount a time when we narrowly escaped. If God hadn't been for us, cancer would have swallowed us alive. The raging waters of depression, waters that had come up to our neck, could have swept us away. The lockdowns and social distancing and closures and cancellations and isolations of 2020 felt like they could keep us trapped forever. That's on an individual level, and then more corporately, we are vulnerable as well. Whole people groups might feel as though they've only been sustained by grace in the face of terrifying foes. Slavery and discrimination against Black Americans, colonization against indigenous people, marginalization and hatred against LGBTQ communities. If God hadn't been for us when everyone else went against us. In fact, as humans, we're so vulnerable that sometimes not everyone makes it out. We are all sitting here carrying in our hearts individuals who haven't survived the flood or the snare. Just as the original singers of this psalm would have known those who didn't survive the siege of Jerusalem or didn't make it back from Babylon. To be clear, it doesn't mean God was not for those people too. It doesn't mean that God isn't for all who face struggle. It just means our human condition is vulnerability. The irony, though, is that although we know that life and joy and wholeness are fragile things, we like to pretend not. Rather than confess our vulnerability, our lack of control, we find it so much easier to pretend we're invincible. So we often don't come clean to one another and to God about how vulnerable we truly are, how lonely we feel, how helpless when experiencing injustice or trying to right injustice, how afraid we are of losing those we love. Look, I found out about this week's mass shooting in Tennessee from Facebook because it was so far down the page when I checked the Washington Post online that I almost missed it. And if that doesn't scream a culture that would rather not face its sins and mortality, that would rather numb itself to pain or pretend it's just normal and acceptable and the price of business to experience these kinds of violence, then I don't know what does. My 3-year-old already buys into this very American approach, I've noticed. If she skins her knee, she cries until she has a Band-Aid covering it up. Because then she actually believes that covering up the wound makes it better. Or at least it's something she can control. Covering it up is something she can control. In the grown-up version, instead of admitting vulnerability, some of us go on the offensive to make ourselves feel better. to claim God's mantle and lean into the power we do have, whether that's a nation's military might or financial resources, or wearing our Sunday best even when we feel so vulnerable. A group example would be, think of white nationalists, white supremacists fearful of losing power, covering up their own broken humanity by claiming God's direction to justify horrific acts and great harm. All of these ways of dealing with vulnerability are absolutely toxic to individuals, to communities, and to an entire nation. And then on a more personal level, some of us try to maintain a sense of control by believing that if we pray prayers the right way or at the right time or get enough faithful prayer warriors to join us, things will turn out okay because God's on our side, right? And some of us, in a more subtle way, just pretend we're fine. I mean, how many of you have masked your vulnerability from friends, family, and church family who didn't have to do that in the year 2020, perhaps sharing a tiny bit of the difficulty you were experiencing, but pretending you were coping better than you are? It's a survival tactic because it's scary to admit how vulnerable we are and how little we can control. But to pretend is also toxic to us because it isolates us and reduces us of an opportunity to grow in trust. We are all vulnerable, that's simply the truth. As humans, we all know those who have been swallowed alive or trapped. As humans, most of us have all had moments where we felt the waters up to our neck in some sense, but pretending doesn't make us less vulnerable. Trust is the true antidote to vulnerability. I'll say that again. The true antidote to vulnerability is not trying to control it, not pretending things are fine, but leaning into trust. And that is where this psalm invites us in the end. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. We needn't pretend we haven't been nearly swallowed alive. We needn't pretend that even in our escape from difficulties, we sometimes feel like tiny birds living in an environment of predators and risks. But we choose to confess that fragile reality and trust God anyway. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. We choose to let down our individual walls and our toxic way of trying to control things and to trust each other anyway, joining a whole community of people who are a little scared or a little hurt and therefore not alone. One of the professors at my seminary, Dr. Kate Bowler, was diagnosed in 2016 with incurable stage 4 colon cancer at the age of 35. She had a 1-year-old son. In the face of such very obvious mortality and vulnerability, such great risk of literally being swallowed alive, she found that so many people wanted to respond to her pain with an impulse to control things. Everything happens for a reason, they'd say, leaving her wondering what could possibly be the reason for her to be on the precipice of leaving a husband and young son. Or they'd try to control things by telling her to try this kale salad diet to fix things, or to make a bucket list of achievements and experiences to cover over the pain. But what she found in the end was much more comforting, was simply to admit how profoundly out of control and vulnerable she felt, and yet how profoundly loved she knew she was, even still, loved by God and loved by the community that was keeping her afloat. Therapy and the God who is our help, Dr. Bowler, is still alive today, and I know she's enjoying every moment with her son, despite continued uncertainty of what comes next. The line between God is our help, though, and God is on our side, and only our side, is a thin line. The line between trusting God and claiming to control God is thin. So to protect us from that tendency to try and hoard God only for our side, we might remember to pray this psalm not only for ourselves, but also on behalf of others as well. In the same breath we say, God is our help, we might also say, God be the help of all who are fleeing in fear of being swallowed alive. Today, Afghan refugees, Salvadorans, Haitians. God be the help of all who have the waters up to their neck. Literal waters for people like the Rohingya in Bangladesh and South Sudanese living through literal floods. God be the help of all who are seeking to fly free from the snares of injustice, mass incarceration, so many other things. God be for us, but God be for us all. And that brings us to Romans. Because centuries after this psalm was written, the Apostle Paul, a lifelong Jew well acquainted with these scriptures, picked up similar language from this psalm when he wrote the beautiful words in Romans 8, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" In the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, Paul knew that God is for us all. Jesus made clear that God wants all people to live in justice and wholeness, all people to be reconciled with one another and with God, all people to be welcomed and shown hospitality and kept safe. That is the side that God is on. God is against injustice and cancer and depression and addiction and violence and poverty and hatred. But God is for us. We are so vulnerable, and in the same breath, we are so loved. And that is why, despite all our close calls, we can have not only the vulnerability of a bird sprung from a trap, but also the freedom. The freedom to stop trying to pretend we're in control, the freedom to confess openly that sometimes it feels like the waters are up to our neck, and the freedom to trust that nothing can separate us from God's love. And knowing that God is for us, we can fly free, free as a bird from the snare of the Fowler. Thanks be to God.